Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, after that stirring and well-focused opening remarks by His Excellency Mohammed Al-Gergawi, we now get to the substance of the program that's been assembled for the Arab Strategy Forum. The purpose of this forum, which as you know is described as forecasting the next decade, 2020 to 2030, is to try to give an element of foresight that will enable us to manage uncertainty, mitigate risk, in order to be able to unlock opportunity. It is not intended to be prescriptive. It is intended to be an indication of a roadmap in respect to the future so that we can do those three things: deal with uncertainty, manage and mitigate risk, and exploit opportunity. Before we get into the longer-term trends, we have the privilege this morning of having the Chief Executive Officer of Control Risks, Nick Allan, who is going to launch in the course of the next 24 hours the risk map for 2020 that Control Risks puts out each year, and give us a highlight of the top 5 risks that Control Risks sees for the year 2020. Nick, can I ask you to join us? Nick, would you like to take a seat there? I know it's got my name on it, but I think it was a good idea to have you out here in the first place. Before we come to Nick's presentation, we're going to challenge all of you by asking you 3 pertinent questions about what you foresee in terms of developments over the next decade. 3 questions. You have voting instruments next to you on your chairs. As each one of the questions come up, look at it carefully, take a position in respect of yes or no. It's fortunately not a complicated decision, and then determine what you feel about the question that is up in front of you. So as you can see, the voting keypad is there. Press on the number that corresponds to your answer, and then you can, after you finish the 3 questions, put down the keypad as well. First question: will a cyber attack shut down a major infrastructure system over the next decade by 2030? Yes or no? Yes, 1, 2, no. Second question: will OPEC survive in a decarbonizing world economy? 1, yes, 2, no. Third question: will we see an acceleration in nuclear weapons proliferation in the region in the next decade? 1, yes, 2, no. Right, let's see how you've responded. So, 82% think that a cyber attack will shut down a major infrastructure system by 2030. Only 18 doubt that. The second one? 61% think that OPEC will survive in a decarbonizing world economy, but 39% are skeptical. And 62% expect that we will see an increase, an acceleration in nuclear weapons proliferation in the region. If that isn't a sufficient backdrop to enable me to ask Nick Allan to tell you about the existential risks facing us in the year ahead of us, I don't know what would be. Nick.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests. For those of you who don't know Control Risks, we're a business risk consultancy, 37 offices around the world, about 2,000 people, 100 or so here in this region. And for the last 2 decades, every year about this time of year, we launch our risk map for the year ahead. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be launching it here this morning at the Arab Strategy Forum. There can be no question that the structures and frameworks and global order that many of us have got used to is changing. The United States of America clearly remains the world's preeminent and predominant military, cultural, economic, and political power, but it is also less interested in what is going on outside of its own borders. And what we see at the moment is new powers who perhaps have less of a vested interest in that old world order challenging the boundaries. And I think it's fair to say we live in an era of extraordinary political change. I'm going to talk about, as Sean said, the key risks for 2020, but I think you will see in these risks many of the seeds that will affect the next decade as this forum looks forward to 2030. So we start with our top risk for the year ahead, which is geopolitics and specifically the US campaign trail. As we all know, the United States is heading into an election year. And foreign policy from the United States will be even more unpredictable than it has been, and business will need to react in particular to that, and governments as well, and react is probably the operative word. Foreign policy decision-making in the United States is becoming ever more centralized around a small group of people, and we have a US State Department that I think it's fair to say is somewhat understaffed, demoralized, and increasingly politicized. And the US Congress will not restrain the President of the United States. And I think all of us would be wise, if we are not already, to follow President Trump on his Twitter account. About 5 a.m. Washington time is normally when things get going. And ourselves, and indeed the State Department, can follow what's going to happen on that forum. It is indeed unusual. But it is a domestic election that will be driving US foreign policy. And so just briefly, what do we think will its effects be? So in North Asia, the United States looking for some probably kind of truce, I think, in that arrangement with China. The economy is an important factor in the election, but as is very clear in the presentations outside this room, the United States and China locked in the next decade and probably beyond in a competition that is both technological and economic, and hopefully not military. For North Korea, I think we will see more tests from North Korea next year. We're already seeing some signs of that activity. I think President Trump finding it impossible to square that deal in which the North Korea will not denuclearize. Why would they? And a deal that he's unable to sell at home. So we expect more of that. Between the United States and the European Union, I think more divergence on issues such as the economy, such as Iran, such as climate change. And for business, this matters. If you're a French cheesemaker or you make French cookware, you find yourselves facing huge tariffs this week on the back of disputes over a digital tax that the French government is introducing, hitting largely American firms. In the Middle East, US foreign policy, maximum pressure on Iran, that will carry on, met with maximum resistance from Tehran. And that is not going to change in the year ahead. And we will see more provocation from Iran as it tests those boundaries of American tolerance. Some tactical operations, perhaps in Syria, as we saw, the removal of US troops, allowing Turkish forces in. But by and large, the United States administration has limited strategic interest in the Middle East going forward. And I think that is a significant shift. The second risk to talk about is the activist society. 2019, an extraordinary year of protests all around the world, from Santiago to Hong Kong, and if you think closer to home, Algeria, Iraq, Iran, Sudan. Activism varied in its causes, but we live in an age fueled by technology where business in particular, but governments also, find themselves in the scope of activist sites. The challenge for business is often those activists are within the business, and there is no better example, I think, in Hong Kong, where companies are having to choose sides between what the Chinese state might wish to happen and what the people within their own companies want to see going on. It was interesting to see the Business Roundtable, which is a US collection of 150 of their largest firms, redefining the purpose of business and shareholder value, coming in at fifth behind other such matters, such as employees, customers, suppliers, and communities. And governments also starting to regulate around issues such as the environment, modern slavery, and indeed gender. And so a changing environment for business to avoid getting caught in the crosshairs. The third risk around cyber warfare, and I'm not sure I share the optimism of the 12% or 18% who don't think we will see major infrastructure hit by a cyber attack. We think 2020 will be the year where this gets significantly worse. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. One, we live in an age of connectedness for business, certainly technologically. So the Internet of Things, 5G, smart cities, more undersea cables. So the attack surface, if you want, is increased. But also, we live in an age where politics is played out often in the cybersphere and where the rules have yet to be established. And for those of you who follow these news, just recently on APT-33, which is an Iranian cyber unit, very clearly setting itself up to attack major infrastructure if needs be. The United States has been quite vocal in the fact that it will use its impressive cyber capabilities more overtly and aggressively to deter, but also you have, particularly in the year coming up, countries wanting to test the boundaries, whether that be Russia, whether that be Iran, whether that be North Korea. And infrastructure is where they will be focused. And we think 2020 will be the year where we see that really spill over. And as you think forward, and there's a fantastic map outside there that shows you the risks around cyber, a risk, I think, for the next decade and beyond. The fourth risk we look for is economic anxiety, meeting political fragility. I saw in the press yesterday on the report produced by this forum, we're not predicting a recession like we saw in 2008, 2009, but there is an economic slowdown going on, and that will impact the United States, it will impact the European Union, China probably around 6% growth, which is sufficient certainly for China to maintain its political stability. But there is a clear link, I think we all know, between economics and geopolitical uncertainty, and in a slowing economic environment, there will be countries that face more pressure, face more political challenge as governments are unable to produce the growth that is needed. And also at a time where I think those institutions that we've got used to are less capable than they were, whether that be the IMF, for example, or the World Bank. There's currently the US administration being quite vocal on a $1 billion World Bank loan to China, things we haven't seen before. So I think the capability of those institutions to respond, if you're thinking forward into the next decade, is much worse than it used to be. And finally, the key risk, I think, that we see, our fifth risk for the year ahead, which is around leaders without strategies, and appropriate, I think, to be raising this at a strategy forum. I started the talk talking about the change in the geopolitical world order, and so many of the issues that face countries, indeed the world, for the next year and into the next decade require strategic responses, whether that be climate change, whether that be nuclear non-proliferation, whether that be inequality. If you think in this region, issues such as education, economic diversification, political representation, all issues that require a strategic response. We see governments responding very tactically to short-term issues and not thinking ahead. As someone from the United Kingdom, I can tell you what happens when tactics overrule strategy. We had a very tactical decision about 4 years ago from the Prime Minister of the day, and we find ourselves, the United Kingdom, in a mess of political risk that I can tell you will not be solved on Thursday. We live in a time where strategy is needed, and I think when we look to the leadership globally, we find an absence of that, and businesses will have to respond to that. About 2 or 3 years ago, I remember listening to General Michael Hayden, who'd been formerly head of the CIA and the NSA, and he said, what will make the next decade or this next century a good one? One, he said, was the United States' relationship with China. But the second thing he said that really resonated to me was he said, things that we thought were fixed are not quite as fixed as we thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. Well done. Thanks very much, Nick. I think that's a wonderful point of departure for the rest of the day. I'm going to try and sketch for you trends over the next decade to build on the threats that we foresee in the immediate term. And then we're going to go into a series of deep dives into matters that are of critical importance in the context of developing strategic responses to the challenges of time. We're going to be looking at the question of political Islam. We're going to be looking at the question of the economic circumstances of the Arab world. We're going to be looking at the political responses to a changing environment within the Arab world. We're going to be looking at the role of regional and other powers in the Arab region, and that includes Turkey and Iran, and in addition to that, Russia. And then we're going to close out with a discussion around the relationship between the United States and China, which will clearly be highly influential in shaping the landscape that all of us will have to grapple with in the next decade. So take what I'm going to say now as simply the first sip of a rich cocktail that you're going to be drinking over the rest of the day. We're speaking here to the concept of the megatrends that are likely to shape the world up to 2030. The logic here is really very simple. We think there are 8 megatrends which are interacting with one another in order to bring about an inflection point in the evolution of the global landscape. And I'm going to discuss those with you in very superficial terms in the next few minutes. The first thing is that we have seen the Earth's center of economic gravity shift radically. That is where it moved to, that 1950 point, by the end of the Second World War. And as you can see, by 2025, it's anticipated that the center of economic gravity in the world, the aggregate of gross domestic product from different parts of the world, will have moved more or less back to where it was before the Industrial Revolution. And the reason for that, of course, is the rise of China, the rise of India, and the rise of Southeast Asian states. But what it has brought about is a complete reallocation of economic capacity in the world at large, and that has a series of significant consequences. The second thing is that we face, in the short term, significant vulnerabilities in our economic system. Broadly, we've seen a strong recovery in capital market performance, particularly in the United States. But associated with that, we have significant fiscal over-indebtedness as well as corporate over-indebtedness. We have lower negative interest rates in most of the advanced economies, which means in practical terms no room for the use of monetary policy to offer countervailing forces against recession. We have slowing manufacturing activity and global trade, not least because of higher tariffs and policy uncertainty, and as a consequence, we've also got slowing investment. All of these expose vulnerabilities right across the system, and one of the consequences of that is that the IMF's latest forecast for global GDP growth in 2020 is down to 3.4%, which is nearly as low as it was during the Great Recession of 2008 to 2014. The implications for the Arab region of that are quite straightforward. Ensure that one is not over-leveraged. Keep debt to GDP ratios at modest levels. Oil exporters should, in all likelihood, premise their future fiscal spending plans on an adjusted Brent spot oil price of roughly $60 a barrel. And refresh contingency plans for the risk of a significant contraction of trade, travel, and tourism, both because of cyber threats and because of the possibility of an economic downturn. It's not a question of saying it's going to happen in 2020 or 2021. It's a question of ensuring that one has contingency plans in one's pocket to be able to deal with the uncertainty associated with it. Nick spoke cogently to the point of weakening US power projection. And this point is a trend which I think is going to continue throughout the whole of the decade. So as not to argue the point in a contentious way, I'm taking the RAND Corporation's report on the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which found quite simply that the strategy recognizes that the capabilities of US military forces have been eroding vis-à-vis those of key adversaries. As a consequence, the US ability to influence events in East Asia and Europe is being undermined, and the US could find itself playing a greatly diminished role internationally. That reality, combined with a lack of political appetite for power projection in the United States today, presages a trend of a reduction in US power projection. And there are many examples of this, but you can see it already in terms of both the East Asian and East China and South China Seas, where China is moving into a position of dominance. The key implications for the Arab region: GCC states will need to develop multi-layered bilateral security arrangements. You'll need to deepen defensive capabilities against cyber and hybrid warfare, which is going to become characteristic of the future, and revitalize efforts to construct a regional security order to control the risks that you were describing earlier in terms of your own voting patterns. Nobody can afford, quite bluntly, a highly significant increase in cyber attack, and nobody can afford a significant increase in nuclear weapons proliferation. The third element is that the rules-based international order is fracturing on many levels. And we can see this, firstly, in the reality that no hegemon is in a position to impose order on the landscape today. NATO is not what it was. The Atlantic Alliance is under stress, to be polite about it. Tensions between Washington and Tokyo and Washington and Seoul are considerable. And ironically, it sometimes seems as though relationships with erstwhile opponents are better than with erstwhile allies. So under those circumstances, it's quite clear that there is fear on the part, inter alia, of the United Nations. As Antonio Guterres said just a few weeks ago at the Paris Peace Forum, the world is breaking apart. The status quo is untenable. He went on to say, no country is capable of bringing these fault lines in isolation, separately from the rest of the world. We need a universal system that respects international law with strong multilateral institutions, but the ones we have, he said by implication, are not fit for purpose. These must adapt to the challenges of today and tomorrow, and that is why I've launched reforms to make the United Nations more effective and agile. Implications for the region are clear. UN at 75 is the United Nations program for 2020 to seek to redefine how the multilateral system should work. Gulf states should engage actively in that program and help to shape the future in ways that are consistent with your own interests. One needs to clarify the optimal and feasible role of GCC states and the Arab region in a new order, and one needs to build multifaceted alliances in order to enable that. The UAE, not least because you have a very impressive young Minister of Youth, is in a position in the context of UN at 75 to convene international youth gatherings to define the future we want. This is part of Guterres' plan, and to use Expo 2020 and the World Government Summit 2020 to help shape these outcomes. I just want to emphasize there is an extraordinary opportunity available in 2020 to impact significantly on the emerging order, which is in any event in the position of changing quite radically at the moment. As a result of the fact that the geopolitical landscape has been transformed by the shift in the geoeconomic center of gravity, the global security architecture that was created after World War II to contain Soviet expansionism has shown gaps in critical areas. And those gaps are between the Mediterranean and Central Asia. Think of the Arab Spring as a small example of the totality of that particular threat. Secondly, in Russia's near abroad, both in respect of Georgia and Ukraine, but we haven't seen the last of that. And thirdly, on China's maritime periphery. The days in which the United States Fourth Fleet controlled the Pacific are over. And we are going to see, inevitably, as a consequence of China's rise, China's assertion of its historical claims to sea territory as well as islands in both the East China and South China Seas. Hybrid and asymmetric warfare is going to become a major threat in all of these regions and elsewhere. And as we have no rules of engagement and effective regional security architectures in these regions, it's going to be extremely difficult to manage it. Think of the deployment of mercenary forces on an increasing scale inter alia by the Russian Federation, and you will have some sense of what is occurring and what is likely to continue to occur. So, multi-actor tensions in the Arab region, US, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and then the alliance between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, presage instability, but create opportunity. If you find yourself the victim of those tensions, it will be extremely difficult. If you engage actively in shaping constructive outcomes, one can have an entirely different impact on the whole process. GCC states will need to strengthen their defensive capability against cyber and hybrid warfare and actively explore the viability of a regional security arrangement. And just in case it's not clear, I'm being discreet on the slides, but that means finding a way to cause Iran to behave as a responsible state actor and not as a revolutionary power projecting power to the disadvantage of other states. The next major trend is not as simple as the fourth industrial revolution. It's actually the first post-industrial biodigital revolution. It is of an order of magnitude much greater than I think most of us recognize on an ongoing basis. The technological output out of research pipelines in not only ICT, but biotechnology, nanotechnology, and neurotechnology is staggering. As a consequence of that, these congruent and conflating technologies are going to pose challenges to every element of our existence. The worlds of work and education are going to be radically disrupted. The convergence in these areas is going to pose moral and policy dilemmas in fields from health regulation and human enhancement to military ethics. The moment you are in a position to transform that which is a human, whether it's a special forces soldier or whether it's a disabled person or whether it's a Silicon Valley billionaire seeking to ensure that his or her children have an unequal start in life, we are going to be faced with a range of moral and social questions which we haven't had to confront up to this point in time, but they're going to be part of this whole experience. The key implications for the Arab region of that phenomenon, firstly, the disruption of employment is going to trigger protests and civil unrest. That's probably manageable in the smaller Gulf states. It's not going to be manageable in the Levant. And under those circumstances, plans need to be put in place in order to be able to deal with those challenges. Disruptive social actors, whether they're anarchist, whether they're jihadist, whether they're anything else, sectarian, are going to exploit that circumstance. And the GCC states will therefore need to radically revise their education systems to enable flexibility and continuous reskilling, invest in innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems to enable fast learning and fast transition of the economic landscape, and engage in public-private transnational partnerships to address the challenges of under-resourced areas. It's not going to be possible in the next decade to isolate these problems to other areas. It's going to become an increasing problem, as everyone discovered in the context of the large-scale migrations following the Syrian civil war. Get out ahead of this curve and deal with these challenges in meaningful ways. The significant social disruption that I'm speaking of here goes beyond the biodigital revolution. It's a function of the gap between the 1% and the rest, the inequality of income and wealth, which will continue to rise because of the biotechnical revolution itself. Under those circumstances, not only returns to capital, but returns to technology ownership will increase dramatically, and returns to labor will continue to fall. So under those circumstances, this is a further source of social protest, and societies, in order to be able to deal with the challenges of that period, are going to need institutional flexibility and extraordinary levels of social cohesion to be able to manage these disruptions. The key implications are, firstly, prepare for frustration with inequality, wealth, and opportunity to spill over onto the streets from Algeria across to Egypt and Iraq. It's going to become a phenomenon across the entirety of the space. And GCC states will have to support under-resourced countries with skills development programs to allow them to adapt and to access new skill-based opportunities. Furthermore, it would be sensible to develop appropriate offshoring programs, perhaps in cooperation with the European Union, to allow lower-skilled economic activities to be undertaken in Arab countries in North Africa and the Levant, which from the perspective of the EU will slow migration, and from the perspective of those countries themselves will allow for employment creation and perhaps a higher degree of social stability. Weakening national governance is the natural consequence of everything that we've been describing. State sovereignty and authority are being undermined in most parts of the world. Governments are unsure about what policies to adopt, and deliberations become protracted and rancorous. Neo-nationalism and populism are rising. Youth are becoming impatient with slow decision-making, and as a consequence of that, social media is transforming politics, and protesters are taking to the streets. This trend is going to continue throughout the decade, and it's not only going to be in democratic societies or in malfunctioning states, it's happening even in let's call them authoritarian, well-disciplined societies like China, as Hong Kong provides an example of. The implications of that from the perspective of the region is that, firstly, subnational groups and transnational sectarian forces will play larger roles in fragile states, and Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon are obviously particularly vulnerable. GCC states will have to stay ahead of the curve, using both old and new instruments to understand and meet economic and social needs of citizens and residents, and leading GCC states should help to embed these capabilities in other states in the region, perhaps through the UAE's World Government Summit and bilateral cooperation programs. Taking responsibility for the larger landscape is going to become essential. And the last element of all of this is that we are today moving up to 8 billion people. By 2030, we'll be at 8.5 billion people. 5.1 billion of those will be in urban areas. And that inevitably means higher consumption, higher production, and higher waste. The falling stock of groundwater, wilderness, and biodiversity is evidence of the strains that urbanization is bringing. Climate change is creating systemic feedback loops, threatening both the health of the oceans and human survival. There is inevitably going to be significant pressure to reduce fossil fuel usage and reduce consumption and accumulation. And the one thing that we can be quite certain of is that we're going to see even greater disruptions of our ordinary lives over the course of the next decade than we've seen in the past several years. The implications of that for the Arab region are, firstly, that climate change will drive competition for water and other scarce resources and trigger forced migration, especially in the Levant. GCC states will need to accelerate energy transitions to electricity generation, mobility, and urban living, and factor the impacts of climate and extreme weather into urban development planning. And GCC states should lead multilateral efforts together with leading advanced economies to design and deploy leading-edge, effective climate adaptation strategies fit for regional purposes. It's another example of getting out ahead of the curve. I'm going to close simply with two sets of scenarios. On the global scale, these trends could play out broadly in two ways. We could end up with a bipolar world split between Washington and Beijing as two anchors of centrality, with others being forced to take sides and align themselves in terms of standards and alliances. That world would be a thoroughly unpleasant place to live in. Alternatively, we can find ways through UN at 75 and other initiatives to enable a constructive equilibrium where we avoid the so-called Thucydides trap, find a basis on which accommodation becomes possible, and optimize for best outcomes. We have a third scenario, if you take a look at the book, we have a third scenario which we call archipelagos, where the European Union plays a tipping role in respect of these two, but these are the two stark illustrations of it. In terms of the region, you have, in one sense, a mirror image of that. You have destructive decline, and you have regional transformation. In destructive decline, the region does not have the ability to be able to extract value even from a constructive equilibrium scenario on the global scale, because the tensions within the region themselves are so great that the attention of policymakers is focused on the short term on a continuing basis. It's one of the prime reasons why it's necessary to take the opportunity today to get out ahead of that curve and start thinking strategically about how to create a regional transformation that allows for this region to play the role that it is capable of playing in shaping the world of tomorrow. Thank you very much.